In January alone, Ukraine's unmanned forces were reported to have hit more than 27,000 Russian targets and destroyed more than 10,000 of them. But the real story may be even bigger than those numbers. Something deeper is starting to change on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine, and it could reshape how ground war is fought in the years ahead. Machines that were once used mainly to carry ammunition, move supplies, and evacuate the wounded are now being pushed toward roles much closer to actual combat. That shift matters because the front has become deadly in a new way. FPV drones now hang over the battlefield so often that even a short supply run can turn into a death trap. A pickup truck loaded with ammunition can be found, tracked, and destroyed within minutes. A team trying to move water, batteries, or medical equipment can be exposed before it even reaches the line. Under that kind of pressure, every basic task starts to look like a gamble with human lives. That is why ground robots are no longer being seen as strange experiments or side tools. They are starting to look like a practical answer to a brutal problem. And if this trend keeps moving forward, what is happening now may not be just a temporary battlefield fix. It may be an early sign that modern land warfare is entering a very different phase. Ukraine did not bring ground robots onto the battlefield as a show of future technology. It did so because too many basic military tasks had become deadly for human beings, and the front was forcing commanders to find a harder, colder, but more practical answer. That pressure begins with the shape of the modern battlefield itself. In eastern Ukraine, danger no longer starts only when an assault begins or when troops reach the trench line. It starts the moment anything moves in open ground. FPV drones, aerial reconnaissance, artillery correction, and constant surveillance have turned short trips into high-risk missions. A soldier carrying ammunition, a team moving water, a driver delivering batteries, or medics trying to pull out a wounded man can all be detected long before they reach their destination. In that environment, even routine support work starts to look like frontline combat. That is why the first real value of UGVs appeared in logistics rather than direct fire. Ground robots offered something simple but important. They could move into places where men were exposed, and they could do it without adding another body to the casualty list. A machine does not panic under drone noise. It does not slow down because of fear. It does not need food, rest, or medical evacuation. If it is hit, the loss is material, not human. On a battlefield where survival often depends on reducing visible movement, that difference matters more than it would in a conventional war. The military logic behind this is not hard to see. Ukraine has to hold a long front under constant pressure while also protecting a limited pool of manpower. That creates a double burden. Troops are needed to defend positions, respond to Russian probes, and rotate through dangerous sectors. At the same time, those same forces are also needed for supply runs, casualty evacuation, engineering tasks, and battlefield recovery. Every soldier used for rear support near the line is one less soldier available for combat. Every team lost while carrying basic supplies weakens the defense twice, first in numbers and then in morale. This is where ground robots became useful in a very practical sense. By the end of 2025, Ukraine was reported to have accumulated around 15,000 UGV systems of different types. That number matters not because every robot is advanced or heavily armed, but because it shows scale. These systems were increasingly handling frontline logistics tasks that had once depended on trucks and exposed crews. It changes how long positions can be sustained under fire, how fast wounded troops can be reached, and how often commanders have to risk trained personnel for simple but dangerous work. There is also a deeper reason this early UGV role matters. Logistics is often treated as background activity, but on this battlefield, it has become one of the most dangerous parts of the war. Casualties can only survive if evacuation does not break down under pressure. When all of that has to happen under the eyes of drones, The side that finds a safer delivery method gains more than convenience. It gains endurance. So the first stage of Ukraine's UGV story was never about replacing the infantryman in battle. It was about keeping the front alive without spending soldiers on tasks that machines could absorb more cheaply. That is what gave ground robots their foothold. They entered the war not as symbols of futuristic ambition, but as tools of battlefield survival. And once that role proved its worth, the pressure of the war began pushing them towards something larger. Ground robots became truly important when Ukraine's supply vehicles started to die faster than they could safely move. That was the moment the issue stopped being about whether UGVs looked modern or impressive, and became a question of which system had a better chance of keeping the front alive under constant drone pressure. At first, many Ukrainian troops were not fully convinced by these machines. A pickup looked faster, simpler, and more familiar. A driver could react to the ground, turn quickly, and push forward with a kind of urgency that a robot often could not match. Early UGVs moved slowly and did not give soldiers the same confidence that comes from seeing a human crew behind the wheel. On a battlefield where seconds matter, that skepticism was easy to understand. But the battlefield itself started to change the argument. Russian FPV strikes were putting growing pressure on the roads and tracks that linked rear positions to the forward line. Units were reported to be especially dangerous in this role, hunting the pickup trucks that Ukraine had often relied on for short-range logistics. Once those vehicles became easier to spot and easier to destroy, speed stopped looking like a complete answer. A fast truck that burns on the route is less useful than a slower machine that actually reaches the trench. That change in perception matters because it reveals how drone warfare is altering basic military logic. In older conditions, mobility often meant moving faster than danger. In eastern Ukraine, mobility increasingly means moving in a way that is harder to detect, less costly to lose, and more sustainable under repeated attack. A low-profile platform crawling through rough ground may not look efficient in peacetime terms, but on a drone-watched battlefield, it can become the more rational option. This is why the shift from pickup to UGV is more important than it first appears. Burned-out trucks on supply paths became proof that human-carried logistics was being pushed into a deadlier phase. At the same time, the robots that many had mocked for being too slow were still able to carry ammunition and equipment toward dangerous sectors. That contrast changed attitudes. According to Yuri Paritsky of the Ukrainian company DevDroid, early jokes about UGVs gave way to demand once soldiers saw them passing the wrecks of destroyed pickups on their way to the line. The message from the front became much clearer. A machine that arrives slowly is still better than a vehicle that never arrives at all. Several platforms help show why this happened. The track Termit can carry up to 440 pounds, operate for 12 hours or about 50 miles, and is built to resist jamming. The Muraka reportedly carries more than 1,100 pounds over long distances in mined and artillery-threatened zones. The larger Protector is designed as a frontline workhorse and can haul up to 2,650 pounds of heavy cargo, including ammunition, mortar systems, and engineering material. Ukraine has also received at least 150 THEMIS systems from Estonia, with Dutch support, adding another proven platform to this growing logistics layer. Still, the deeper point is not the specification sheet. It is what these systems allow Ukraine to do under real combat conditions. They help keep ammunition moving when roads are watched. They reduce the need to expose drivers and support teams. In that sense, UGVs became necessary because the battlefield made the old method far more expensive in casualties. And once that lesson became clear, ground robots stopped being a novelty and started becoming part of frontline survival. Ukraine is now pushing ground robots beyond supply work and into direct combat support, and that shift may be one of the most important changes now taking shape on the battlefield. What began as a practical answer to the problem of moving ammunition and equipment under drone threat is now becoming an attempt to place remote-controlled firepower where sending a human soldier would be far more dangerous. Ukrainian units need systems that can take over some of the most exposed jobs in battle. In many sectors, a rifleman, machine gunner, or support team moving into position is at risk almost from the start. Drones can spot movement quickly, artillery can be corrected fast, and even a short delay in open ground can turn into a fatal mistake. Under those conditions, the value of a combat UGV is clear. It can move the weapon forward without exposing the crew that would normally have to carry it. That is why Ukraine has started adapting these platforms for weapons that can do real battlefield work. Heavy machine guns are among the most common choices. According to Pravda, the US-made Browning M2 in .50 BMG is widely used because ammunition supply is relatively strong and the weapon offers range and penetration that matter in frontline fighting. When that is not available, other systems such as the PKM, M240, and even salvaged PKMT machine guns can also be mounted. Automatic grenade launchers add another layer to that change. The Mark 19 is a strong example because it shows why this shift matters so much. When humans have to move that kind of weapon into place, the problem is not only the gun itself. The ammunition must also be hauled, the team must reach the position intact, and the whole movement can be seen from above. That makes the mission slow and dangerous before the first round is even fired. A UGV reduces that exposure. It can carry the launcher and ammunition together, arrive ready to engage, and let the crew operate from a safer location. On a battlefield where the route to the firing point may be deadlier than the fight itself, that is a major advantage. Ukraine is also experimenting with more aggressive roles such as kamikaze robots, remote combat modules, and platforms designed to support assault groups from a distance. The goal is not to create a science fiction army. The goal is to replace a soldier in the places where the chance of survival has become too low to ignore. Artificial intelligence is part of this shift, but it is being used in a narrower and more controlled way than some headlines imply. Militarny also reported that AI-powered modules on Ukrainian UGVs help detect movement, identify heat signatures, patrol assigned sectors, and calculate firing data, while the final decision to fire remains with a human operator. These functions matter because they reduce operator workload and improve reaction speed. But the final decision to fire remains with a human. That detail is critical. Ukraine is not handing the right to kill over to a machine. It is using software and sensors to make remote fire support more effective in places where direct human exposure has become too costly. So this is the real turning point. Ground robots are no longer valued only because they can keep supplies moving. They are starting to matter because they can help deliver violence without demanding the same level of human risk. And once that line is crossed, the battlefield begins to change in a much deeper way. Ground robots are becoming more useful on the battlefield, but their strongest role today is still in defense rather than attack. Ukraine is not replacing infantry with machines across the front. What it is doing is finding the areas where robots can already hold value under fire. And right now, that value is clearest when they are used to help protect positions, watch dangerous sectors, and add firepower without exposing more troops. In defensive work, the logic is straightforward. A UGV can be placed in a layered position behind the most exposed edge of the line, often on the second or third belt, rather than right at the point of contact. From there, it can act as a remote observation post, a firing point, or both. That matters in a war where the side that sees first and reacts first often gains the upper hand. A hidden robot with optics, sensors, and a weapon module can wait in silence far longer than a soldier can. This also changes the density of fire along the line. A small team operating from a protected shelter can supervise several sectors at once, while the robots sit dug in and ready to engage when needed. This kind of layered arrangement is especially valuable because it helps Ukraine hold ground with less manpower. That is a serious advantage for a force that has to defend a long front under constant pressure. It means a machine is not just replacing one sentry or one gunner. It is helping stretch limited personnel across a wider area without leaving the defense thin. Still, the limits are just as important as the strengths. Electronic communication remains one of the biggest problems. If the signal is jammed or disrupted, the robot becomes much less effective at the very moment it may be needed most. Mechanical trouble is another issue. A jammed machine gun is not something software can solve on its own. A human still has to fix the fault, and that can force crews into dangerous recovery missions. These are not small technical details. They shape what robots can actually do in battle and explain why their use still requires caution. That same caution becomes even more important in offensive operations. Attack is harder because it demands movement, timing, coordination, and adaptation under pressure. A defensive UGV can sit, watch, and wait. An attacking UGV has to move through uncertain ground, stay linked to operators, work with infantry, and keep its weapons stable enough to matter in the middle of a fast-changing fight. That is a much more complex task. This is why robot assault tactics are still being built in real time rather than drawn from some mature doctrine. Even so, their offensive value is starting to show. Ukraine has used these systems as fire shields, decoys, and support elements for assault groups. Kamikaze robots can hit enemy positions before troops close in. Remote modules can pin defenders down while infantry moves. In one operation, robots carrying mines and a grenade launcher were used alongside an evacuation platform to support an assault from start to finish. That kind of operation shows real promise, but it also proves the broader point. Defensive robot use already has a clearer shape. Offensive robot warfare is still a field of rapid trial, error, and learning under live combat conditions. What Ukraine is doing with ground robots is not just a tactical adjustment. It is starting to reveal a broader shift in how a smaller force tries to survive and compete in a long war against an enemy with more manpower. The core idea is simple, but its meaning is large. If a dangerous task can be done by a machine instead of a soldier, then Ukraine would rather lose metal, batteries, and chassis than lose trained troops who are much harder to replace. That logic matters because the pressure on manpower does not disappear when a battle slows down. A long front consumes people every day. Units need fighters at the trench line, crews for resupply, teams for evacuation, operators for drones, engineers for fortifications, and reserves for sudden attacks. In that situation, every role that can be shifted from flesh to machinery gives Ukraine a little more room to breathe. A destroyed robot is still a loss, but it does not create the same military and human cost as a dead or wounded soldier. That is why the phrase about trading money and metal for enemy manpower is so important. It captures the economic logic of a battlefield where survival depends on preserving people wherever possible. This also shows how war is changing beyond the old question of who has more men. Numbers still matter, and Russia still benefits from being able to absorb losses more easily. But that advantage is no longer the whole story. A side that combines human judgment, unmanned systems, sensors, software, and accurate fire in a smarter way can weaken a larger force over time. In that sense, robotics is not replacing the human side of war. It is reshaping how human strength is organized, protected, and applied. The important contest is no longer only about mass. It is about integration. Ukraine's use of UGVs fits directly into that wider pattern. These machines are not yet replacing infantry in the full sense, and they are not turning the battlefield into a science fiction scene. What they are doing is changing key functions that hold the line together. They are helping move supplies under drone threat. They are reducing exposure in casualty evacuation. They are giving assault units another tool for suppression and breach support. Each of those roles may look limited when viewed alone. Together, they point to a force that is trying to redesign the cost of combat in its favor. That is where the geopolitical meaning begins to widen. Russia is not standing still, and many other states are also moving toward unmanned ground systems, AI-supported targeting, and layered robotic warfare. Ukraine may simply be the first place where this shift is being tested at such speed and under such brutal pressure. What is taking shape in Ukraine is still incomplete, still imperfect, and still full of limits. But it is no longer just a collection of new machines. It is starting to look like an early version of a different kind of land warfare being assembled in real time. The real shock here is that Ukraine no longer seems to treat ground robots as tools standing outside the fight. They are being pulled deeper into the most dangerous parts of the battlefield, from supply runs and casualty evacuation to surveillance, fire support, and even the opening stage of assaults. That alone says a lot about how harsh this war has become. The bigger point is not that robots have replaced soldiers. They clearly have not. Their use in attack is still being learned under live combat conditions, and that means the doctrine is still unfinished. But even with those limits, their value is already too large to ignore. What is changing now is the logic of survival. A military under manpower pressure is starting to trade steel, sensors, batteries, and remote fire modules in order to reduce human loss. That is a major shift. It suggests that modern land war may be becoming a contest of adaptation, integration, and how fast a force can turn technology into real battlefield effect. That also leaves a bigger question hanging over what comes next. Will Ukraine keep pushing UGVs into larger combat roles? Will Russia answer with its own ground robot expansion? If this analysis was useful, please like the video, share it with others following the war, and subscribe to Military Force for more clear and serious coverage of how modern battlefields are changing.